It's called the friendly physician model for private equity. It's remarkable that they actually, employ that term because it's very descriptive and it's also odious.
Welcome to RadCentral, a radiology podcast hosted by Excalibur Healthcare. I'm Laura.
I'm Betsy.
And today we will be sitting down with attorney David Millstein, who is a founder of Millstein Associates, a law firm located in San Francisco, California. We will be discussing corporate practice of medicine and the involvement of private equity in healthcare. So, David, as you'd like to be called, you are nationally recognized for litigating on behalf of physician groups. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? Why did you become an attorney? And how did you come to specialize in this area of practice?
Well, I became an attorney because I thought that I wanted to do some kind of service and make the world better. I was really bad in math, so medicine was not an option, although I was interested in it. And but I became interested in the kinds of things you can do as a lawyer, which is actually, make a difference. And you can win or lose cases. And if you win the cases and you win the right ones, you can affect all sorts of, make all sorts of good things happen in a world that is not fair. So I became interested in the corporate practice issues and representing physicians when many, many years ago, when I was a young attorney, well, a lot younger, 1998, I had a client who I'd done some work for and came to me with a colleague saying, we have, we work in these emergency rooms for then Catholic Healthcare West, and they've come to us and said they're buying a management service organization that they plan to install in all of our emergency rooms. And we're kind of suspicious. This doesn't seem good for us, and it seems like we'll be eventually working for them. So we looked into it. We couldn't get information. We filed a suit eventually that alleged it was a violation of corporate practice of medicine and kickbacks for hospitals to go into the MSO business because they were giving out the contracts, and they could give out the contracts to their own MSO and make a lot of money. It turned out that not only was the hospital taking about 15% of the physician's pay by doing this, but they were also controlling the practice, and they had enormous control. Now, that case resulted in them reversing the merger that caused this, and Catholic Healthcare West lost about $50 million, but they just abandoned it because they were about to lose in court. They were, when the judge said they can't win, what are they doing here? But that was a long fight. And since that time, although we won that battle, we clearly lost the war because private equity, being in the form of a hospital or Wall Street hedge funds, have completely infiltrated the medical field through a variety of complicated and non-transparent transactions, which end result is they control the practice of medicine. The amount of patients that a doctor sees, when he works, how much he makes, all of these things. And as they control the sources of patients, it will get worse and worse.
You said a phrase, "We will eventually be working for them." That sticks out in my mind. And you're talking about a case that happened in the 80s. I feel like you're talking about something that could have happened yesterday based on the news that I'm reading. So to take a step back, every physician should have an understanding of what corporate practice of medicine is, but perhaps not every podcast listener knows what corporate practice of medicine is. Can you take us back to the basics and just give us a little understanding of that?
Yes. Corporate practice of medicine is a prohibition in most states that provides that the practice of medicine is a profession. Doctors can practice medicine, but corporations can't. It's a fundamental division based on the conflicting duties of a professional towards its patient, doctor towards his patient, her patient, and a corporation's duties towards their shareholders. Doctors are bound by oath and the essence of being a physician to do what's in the patient's best interests, make decisions about treatment modalities, about drugs, about everything that is in the best interest of the patient. Corporations, on the other hand, have a sacrosanct duty, not to patients. They have a duty to their shareholders to make profits. So when a corporation owns a medical practice, there is a irreconcilable conflict between the duties of the physicians and the duties of, if their bosses are corporations, the corporation. The corporation needs to do everything it can to maximize profits. And if that means the wait times are high and the periods, if that means seeing 3 patients an hour or 6 patients an hour, they're obliged, as long as they could have some doctor rubber stamp it, they're obliged to see the 6 patients an hour. People sometimes mistake this as it's a question whether the corporations are greedy. No, it's not. Corporations are obliged to make money. They're not doing their duty if they don't make money. And so that fundamental irreconcilability has been recognized for over 100 years and enshrined, and even before that, in the principle that corporations can't own your medical practice. So now we get to the obvious example is if you work for a corporation and practice medicine. It used to be they had company doctors at factories and they worked for the company. Well, let's send this guy back to work. I mean, he doesn't need any more time off. He'll be fine. That was not allowed under corporate practice guidelines. The end of doctors, though, working for corporations hardly stopped the problem, because as the economy got more sophisticated, the corporations, through their smart lawyers, developed a lot of ways to put the corporation's ownership in a doctor's name. So they could say, hey, a doctor owns this. Well, that doesn't solve the problem. When the doctor owns 300 practices, the doctor has never been to those practices. He doesn't know anything about the practice. He just rubber stamps whatever the corporate managers say. So if the corporate managers say, hey, we think we'll get better medical care, because we saw a study somewhere, and it says you can get better medical care if you see patients quickly and don't spend as much time on it. So we're going to do that. And the corporate doctor, which is just a phantom of the corporation, he says this is what we're doing. Now, when you, the line doctor, complains about this and says, wait a second, this isn't good for the patient, they say, well, you don't work for the patient directly, you work for this mega medical practice, and that is owned by this doctor, and he's your boss, and if you don't like it, leave. Well, as when you get to the point where the majority of physicians, the majority of the providers of medical service, HMOs, in the hospitals, when they are, have total control of your city, or the main, you can't go anywhere. And so it becomes a point where the physicians are having to be resigned that they don't have options. And that's how it all gets horrible.
In 2012, only 25.8% of physicians were employed by hospitals or corporate entities. As of January 2024, 77.6% of physicians were employed, with hospitals and other corporate entities being the top employers. Should we be concerned about this trend's impact on physician groups? Should we be concerned about this trend about its impact on patient care?
Yeah, I think you should be terrified. This is not a sort of academic problem. Physicians on every level are feeling this, and it's a complete lack of power over their practice, a complete subversion of the ethical values that cause most physicians to practice in the first place, unfettered allegiance to the interests of the patient. And when you have a corporate overlord whose, as they say, their duty is to generate profits, there's absolutely no way that power equilibrium can stay with the physician, because the physician has no options. So those kind of dynamics operate to subvert the ethical values, because people naturally, they're in a community, they're raising their kids in the community. The corporation decides, yeah, we're going to increase the number of scans you have to read. Well, you don't have to be very perceptive to understand that degrades the quality of care. And yet, like a frog boiling in water, you're not going to notice it right away, but the difference is going to develop into profound degradation of the quality of care, not because physicians are wanting to do that, but just as when you speak out and then suddenly you're not given hours that month, or you're given terrible hours, or you're getting pressure because you're not meeting certain deadlines and other people are getting advantages that you're not getting. At some point, that slow and subtle pressure is going to affect care. The mechanisms through which these groups have done it is remarkable. I gave, for example, the physician who owns many practices. It's called the friendly physician model for private equity. It's remarkable that they actually employ that term because it's very descriptive, and it's also odious, because the doctor who is not supposed to be friendly to the corporation. That's the whole purpose, is that you're not friendly to an entity whose job it is to make profits. You're friendly to your patient. But that's not what the friendly physician model means. Yet this is the predominant model. You mentioned the Catholic Healthcare West case is now Dignity, and there's that case utilized a different model, but there's many models. One of the models I challenged, the friendly physician model in California, in the Envision Healthcare case that recently resolved. And that case involved a physician who owned many practices. The physician in that model, which is repeated everywhere around the country, basically is a figurehead. And recently in Oregon, I was involved in legislation to strengthen their corporate practice of medicine rules. And the president of One Medical, which is a large privately backed equity group, came on and tried to justify the One Medical as, well, they make our appointments for us and they do this administrative stuff, and we don't really want to do that, so we could see more patients, which is absurd. That's not what they do. They schedule you, they collect all your money, they decide how much you're going to get, they decide how you're going to practice, they establish treatment modalities, benchmarking, studies that they will feed you. And when these private equity groups and MSOs are appealing for contracts, exclusive contracts, in many cases, they're telling the hospital how much money we're going to make for you, wait times and not diverting patients, and all the microeconomics of practice, which result in private equity. So if they're pitching you that way, you don't think they're doing it. One of the problems in this area is who's going to fight this, because physicians don't have organizations equipped to do this, and legislatures tend to be difficult to persuade in the face of massive lobbying by the money groups, because basically that's where all the money is in private equity. So when you have Amazon opposing your legislation, they might tread lightly. And so it's a very, I'm coming to believe that lawsuits aren't as effective as legislation. Now, lawsuits can address this, but it's an opportunistic kind of situation where, for instance, one large private medical group, and I've represented some, who have the wherewithal to fight with an MSO. In all of the cases I've done, the MSOs back down because they're wrong. They know they're violating the law. They can't win, but they can get away with it because there's no mechanism for people. Most people, certainly private physicians, can't, file lawsuits for those reasons. So it can be used sometimes as a defense if they get sued for violating a non-compete, for example. I've successfully defended those cases. But, even though you're sitting as a physician working for maybe a big radiology company and who says, we're just providing equipment to you guys, and we're not telling you how to practice, but they are, and the law recognizes that there is no clear line. There's a California case that says there's no clear line of division between the business and the professional side of a medical practice. There's a merging of those two things, and complete control of the business side can equate to control over the professional side.
I don't want to sound naive, but how do they wind up with this involvement that slowly erodes their control over their practice?
Very good question. They're almost, I'd say the majority, I don't know how much of the majority, is a result of retiring physicians who want a retirement plan and sell out their practice. And they have clients, they have some infrastructure, and a private equity group comes along and says, hey, they have some frontman physician, and they say, hey, I'm, going to take over this and we'll pay you all this money, and they get paid for their practice. And they assign over, they establish the MSO structure, whereby MSO or non-MSO, the physician sells, but that physician who you're selling to is a friendly physician, and he has many practices. He's not buying your practice. the private equity group that he is obliged to is buying your practice. And when he sells that practice, he's not allowed to, if he's installed, in some titular leadership position, he can never sell it. The private equity group gets to decide who goes in there. Well, if you can't sell something, you don't really own it, do you? So these complicated non-transfer agreements result in the corporation owning the facility. And then you do that 10 times, and pretty soon you're the dominant player in that area. And you can do whatever you want with your rates. You can do whatever, you can pay physicians whatever you want, because you control so many of the facilities. So at the heart of the evil of corporate practice are selling out physicians, and they're to blame for most of this. Professional medical societies, licensing folks, have authority to discipline physicians for violations of corporate practice of medicine, but they don't.
Okay.
Because they tend to have quite a few of these selling out physicians in their organization, their dominant economic features. So if you are, politically aware, you understand that when you have massive money on one side, unless you have some countervailing money on the other side, it's very difficult to pass legislation that is effective.
Newcomers to an independent physician group don't have the same kind of money to help the practice stay private. Is that, where else?
Well, if you're an employee or an independent contractor of a physician-owned group, you kind of have no power.
Mm-hmm.
You're just working for a guy who has so many hospital contracts or so many of this contracts, and that's a reality. The only thing the physicians can do is walk, but in many environments, as I say, where there's not a lot of practices, that's not even an option.
I found you through the case, the Envision case, and I came across the news that Envision was pulling out of California. I describe it as taking their ball and leaving the playground. They don't want to do business in California when it involves continuing with the lawsuit. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, that's my view. They don't admit that, but we filed a case. I think we got some a very, very early ruling in the case that made it clear that if we could prove what we were saying about the way their company operated, then it would be a classic case of a violation of corporate practice of medicine. And I wouldn't have filed it if I didn't think we could prove it. And I'm 100% confident we would have prevailed in that case. In my opinion, they could not withstand the existence of a California precedent saying that the friendly physician model was blatantly illegal. That would have ramifications for the other 90% of their business in the rest of the country. It also would have ramifications to all private equity groups that would be profound. We wanted to establish that precedent, but once they leave, there's really no case there, or there is difficult impediments to undertaking a case when you don't have what we lawyers call a case in controversy. You have to have an actual dispute. And we weren't suing for money. We were suing to stop for a declaration that this is a practice. This is one of the problems that I've personally experienced with a number of these cases, is when confronted, they can just leave. California maybe represented 10%, 15% of their I don't even think 10% of their national market. Why risk the legality of their practice model? And I had many healthcare lawyers from the other side tell me that, everybody's looking at your case really carefully, because we're going to have to figure out in a different way if you invalidate it. Could they figure out a different way? Well, I think it gets harder and harder as you get pinned in more. But there are very few organizations, groups, or individuals who have the resources to litigate a federal district court case like it. I mean, it's incredibly, it's expensive, and unless you're protecting something that's, it's very hard to justify spending money just for the advancement of a principle.
Okay.
Is that what's stopping other states from suing for the same reasons? Is it the financial obligation?
No, the state itself. I represented the American Academy of Emergency Medicine Professional Group. They were the people who sued. The state did not sue. Could you get a state attorney general interested in the issue to sue? Yeah. I mean, that's possible, but that particular attorney general has to be, willing to withstand the ire of Amazon, for instance, who has or Optum and these massive private equity groups. United Health, they have to be able to withstand that on a local level. And it's hard to find politicians who are running for office who are interested and feel that that is going to do that. I mean, in California, the Attorney General has supported legislation to have reviews of healthcare mergers, and it's a step in the right direction. It creates transparency and it gives some governmental authority, but it's the best would be actual enforcement of corporate practice, which doesn't occur. And this problem isn't just medicine. I mean, it's psychiatry, it's veterinary practice, it's all the professions. They have not yet really seeked into the legal profession, but they're trying. I've noticed that attempts are being made.
I have a quick question. Just this is for my own curiosity. So Envision pulled all of their business out of California, or just the emergency medicine portion of their business? Have they completely removed themselves from California?
Well, I have limited. They've removed all the emergency operations. I'm actually not knowledgeable as to their other operations and what they've done in California,
Okay.
Because I was just sued them over the emergency practices.
Okay, because radiologists have been discussing it, and I was wondering, how it affected them directly or indirectly. So that was just a question that I had.
On the radiology side, Envision, we found that independent of the lawsuit, they were utilizing, and we allege this, that they utilized the acquisition of emergency rooms by giving away subsidy-free radiology agreements. There was in the county that our case arose at, there was a radiology group who was being paid by Tenet Health to a couple of $100,000 a year for the purpose of subsidizing the providing radiologists for the hospital, because that's done. Envision told them that if you give us this great emergency room contract, we will not we will provide you, Tenet, the hospital, with radiology free.
Wow.
So the independent group who was being paid $200,000 was going to, or I think they did lose their contract because free services were being provided. Now, we allege that was a bribe, because it is. They said, no, there's no money. We didn't pay any money. Well, the judge didn't,
Okay.
I don't think he even spent any time discussing that. Obviously, it was a bribe, but radiologists are impacted. And I have talked to radiology groups in California about that. But again, the problem is you would have to have a really big radiology group to be able to go up against them and sue them. You'd have to have that, some 20-member group or 40-member group. That would be difficult for them to withstand that process.
Okay. So it's all very, I find it all very interesting. Before you've given us so much of your time, I really appreciate it. And we're saying important things. Is there something that you want to address that we haven't prompted you with any questions? Is there something that we can give you the microphone to talk about that we haven't talked about already?
I think I touched on it, but I think it's very important for physicians to be more aggressive about protecting their turf. Just on a deal, that trickles up. The only thing stopping it from getting horrible now are just individual physicians thinking of alternatives, not necessarily joining big groups, trying to do things more independently. There's a tremendous influx of concierge physicians in internal medicine. That is directly the result. That's not rich people wanting special treatment. It's affluent people desperate to be able to get some medical care and spending enormous money to do that, just basically rejecting the whole system that we have of insurance-based medical care. So any ways of avoiding that and being activists are good, and I encourage the retiring physicians and others not to deceive yourself and to thinking that you're providing efficiencies and better care to patients by aligning and selling your practice or joining your practice, because you're not. The inevitable effect of money is to run something as a business is different than running it as a profession. Obviously, there's professionals who make decisions that are not in the patient's best interest, and we, as lawyers, I'm critical of those people. Those kind of subtle intrusions, as bad as they've been, are nothing next to the institutional power dynamics of having private equity, because it's just persistent. And I encourage physicians to not, instead of think of it as a, good versus evil, bad rich guys trying to exploit, rake in money and all these kind of metaphors, rich versus poor, to not think of it that way. It's a structural issue. Structurally speaking, private equities are not doing their job if they're not sucking as much profit as they can. They're violating their duty to their shareholders. So those things are incompatible. You cannot serve a private equity boss and your patient with fidelity. You can't do that. So the only way to avoid that is to, I would hope that the private groups can flourish, and if young people can set up their own practice reflecting their own value, younger physicians, they ought to do that, because there's just no comfort at the end of the day when you, as an employee, have really no power to do things the way they ought to be done and the way that people will make you feel good about your practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've had discussions with some radiologists that are not partners, and they've found themselves working for radiology companies that brought in a private equity investor, and the way it was described to me, I learned that private equity was like a marriage with an expiration date, that a private equity investor doesn't come in to a relationship without wanting to see some kind of return that will allow them to sell within a certain amount of time, or that's likely the case. And there are people left at the practice when all of the seniors have gotten their money and they've retired. They're being left with practices that are under the control of the private equity investors, and they wind up getting sold to another company, and then it was never anyone's intention for the second company to get a hold of their practice, and they find themselves in situations that they can't get out of. Is there ever a reverse? Are there private equity infested or independent physician groups that manage to reverse course and get their practice back?
Yes. One of the situations is when private equity comes in and they lose money. They just don't make good decisions. Some of the private equity, they have enormous infrastructure, and those infrastructures are not necessarily efficient. They have a bureaucracy, and in many ways, and many physician entrepreneurs I've talked to say, there's nothing like the old-fashioned way of a doctor who owns a practice, who's looking at the bills, who's looking at everything and managing it. That's the way you achieve maximum efficiency. You might get more customers, and you will get more customers with size and the leverage, such as offering radiology, subsidy-free stuff to get contracts. Hard to compete against that, but many of those models do implode eventually. Envision claims they weren't making any money in California, and that's why they left. But there certainly is a history. Certainly, Envision's bankruptcy suggests that they weren't making money in general. And so when those things implode, if they implode, there is an opportunity for physicians to get back in, because basically they're going bankrupt and can be bought for almost nothing. And I was talking to a bankruptcy attorney in the Envision case who was assisting us, and he was kind of reminding me of how in the 70s there was a lot of what they call roll-ups, purchase of practices, that imploded, and they just couldn't sustain themselves. And it is possible that could happen. Of course, that's not a very powerful position to just be hoping that it fails. And now it's even more difficult because we have a threat of vertical integration where United Health through Optum is purchasing medical practices. So you have a insurer owning the medical practice, which is just a nightmarish situation. Whether that gives new breath to some of the companies that might be imploding, I don't know. You'd have to ask a economist those kinds of questions, but that is an opportunity situation when those things occasionally, just because of bad management, they just don't make it.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And again, I'll ask again, is there anything else you want to say that is unprompted by questions from us?
No, I think I've said enough. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for all this good
Okay, good.
information.
Well, thanks.
Thank
Nice
you so
chatting with
much.
you.
Okay.
Oh, sure.
Goodbye.
Very good. Bye-bye.
All right.
Another fantastic podcast.
Yes.
Laura, why don't you take us out of here?
Sure. RadCentral is a production of Excalibur Healthcare. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and you can find RadCentral wherever you get your podcasts. From all of us at Excalibur Healthcare, have a great week.